All right, so why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started for this afternoon. It is Thursday. It is the 7th of May, 2020. My name is Paul Savoy, and this is the weekly live Zoom meeting for Political Science 1, class number 30585. Several things we're going to go ahead and accomplish today. First thing in just a moment, going to give you a few announcements, reminders, keep you up to date with some things going on with the class. After we do that, I'll then go ahead and take any questions that you might have about the subject that you've been learning about this past week and that you will be responding to in the discussion forum post that is due tonight at 11:59 p.m., of course, not counting the 3-day grace period. And that is on the topic of the U.S. Congress, the first of the 3 national government branches that the framers created through Article 1 of the Constitution. So I'll deal with any questions that you have with Congress. Then after that, finally, we will go ahead and I will give you a brief overview of the notes for the subject that you're going to be working on this coming week, leading up to next Thursday at 11:59 p.m. And that is talking about the second of the 3 national government branches created by the framers in 1787, this time in Article 2 of the Constitution, and that is the presidency. So I'll give you a brief overview of the notes that I posted for you on Canvas yesterday, dealing with the presidency, kind of give you talk about a couple of highlights of the notes that I want you to pay particular attention to, and then I'll deal with any questions that you have about the presidency at that time as well. So before we do anything else, please remember, as always, this meeting is being recorded so that you can go back and review all or any part of it at your leisure. Normally, videos of our weekly Zoom meetings are available to you somewhere between 12 to 24 hours after the meeting ends. And to access our previous weekly Zoom meetings, just go to our Canvas page, click on the ConferZoom link in the left-hand menu. And then once you get to the ConferZoom link, click on the recordings link, and then scroll down till you find the date of the recording that you want, and then click on that link too. And so that's how you can do that. Also, please remember throughout the proceedings this afternoon, if at any time you have a question or a comment, please do speak up. And you can speak up either by muting your microphone and asking your question or making your comment, or if you'd rather, you can go ahead and place your question or your comment in the group chat, and I can respond to it from there, whichever works best for you. So before we go ahead and deal with any questions that you have to do with this week's topic, which is the U.S. Congress, let me just go ahead and give you a few brief announcements and reminders. First announcement, of course, is that I am going to start working on your York test number 2. I'll start grading those tomorrow. So if you've taken test number 2 and submitted test number 2 to me via Canvas, you will see the grades for that test posted on Canvas for you tomorrow. That is Friday, the 8th of May. Now, if you have not yet submitted your copy of test number 2, please do send me a Canvas message or an email ASAP and let me know what's going on. So if you have not yet submitted that test number 2, it's not too late, but I need to know what's going on with you so that we can have you submit the test and we can give you some credit for having taken that test. So please let me know, again, via email or Canvas message, if you haven't yet submitted test number 2 to me via Canvas. And then the other reminder, it is really an ongoing reminder that there are lots of different ways that you can communicate with me during the week if you need to. If you have questions about this class, questions about any of the information that you're learning about in this class, if you have questions about the assignment, or if you have broader questions about political science, about LBCC, about transfer, or maybe you just want to talk to me about something that has nothing to do with school. There are a bunch of different ways that you can reach out and communicate with me. Of course, the easiest and quickest way is via email or Canvas message, but you can also, if you'd rather speak to me face-to-face or at least virtually face-to-face, you can visit me during my twice weekly virtual student hours that I host here on Zoom. And remember, those virtual student hours are every Monday and Wednesday afternoon between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And remember, during those weekly virtual student hours, I'm not lecturing. I'm not doing the stuff that I'm doing during our weekly Zoom class meetings, but I am available for you to talk to me about anything that you need or want to talk to me about. So if you want to go ahead and visit me during one of those virtual student hours, just go to our Canvas homepage for this class. On the homepage, scroll down past the picture to where it says basic course information. And there you will find both the Zoom link and the password that you will need to get into the virtual student hours. So you can always go ahead and communicate with me that way as well. Now, if you want to communicate with me one-on-one via Zoom, but your schedule doesn't allow you to do so, Monday and Wednesday afternoons between 2:30 and 3:30, send me a Canvas message, send me an email, let me know, and we can work out a day and time for us to have a one-on-one Zoom appointment so you can talk to me that way as well. So please, anything you need to talk to me about, don't hesitate, get in contact with me, and let's talk. Let me assist you however I can. All right, so why don't we go ahead and before we do anything else, let me just ask, are there any questions just in general about anything having to do with the class before we go ahead and talk specifically about Congress and then specifically about the presidency? So any general sort of overall questions about the class before we go ahead and move on? You can either unmute your mic, ask a question, or if you'd rather, just go ahead and put your question in the group chat and I can deal with that. Anybody? Okay, so far so good. So let's go ahead and continue. Now, if you were with us last Thursday afternoon, you'll know that we spent the bulk of our time talking a little bit, kind of giving you a preview, an overview of the class notes from Canvas on the subject of the U.S. Congress. And if you recall last week, we said a couple of important things about Congress during our weekly Zoom meeting. One really important part of the notes on Congress that we highlighted last time, was the fact that when the framers sat down to create Congress, that is the legislative branch of the national government, in Article 1 of the Constitution, the framers really were afraid. The framers were incredibly scared of Congress. Specifically, the framers feared that Congress had the greatest potential of the three national government branches to become overly powerful, to spin out of control, and to abuse that power and take away people's natural rights, their basic freedoms, that sort of thing. And we said that at first may sound kind of strange to us, because if we look at how folks in the United States today in 2020 perceive Congress, we see Congress pretty much in about the exact opposite way. Rather than fearing Congress, we tend to see Congress as being the weakest, the least dangerous of the three national government branches, slightly corrupt, slightly self-interested, slightly incompetent, but certainly very few people in the United States today perceive Congress as being the most powerful and the most dangerous of the three national government branches. And so one of the first things we talked about last week in doing kind of an overview of the Congress notes is to understand how we got from there to here. How do we get from the framers fearing an overly powerful and abusive Congress to where we are today, where we tend to see Congress as being this big, weak, rather awful joke, right? And the way that we got from there to here, well, as we said, it was the framers' fault, okay? Because when the framers sat down to actually create the structure and function and power and process of Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, they were really motivated by their fear, their desire to avoid creating an overly powerful Congress. So what they did, as we said last week, is that they very carefully attempted to box Congress in, meaning that as they created Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, they very carefully specified what Congress could and could not do. That way, Congress would be powerful enough to carry out the basic jobs that it had to carry out from day to day, but Congress would not have any additional, any extra, any unnecessary power left over that it could go ahead and abuse. So the framers, like I said, very carefully tried to limit the power of Congress. And guess what? As we said last week, the framers did such an effective job of limiting the power of Congress, they actually went too far. They actually limited congressional power too much. And that's why we perceive Congress in the year 2020 as being relatively powerless, overly weak, and not all that competent. That's how we got from there to here. The framers so feared Congress spinning out of control that they really overdid it in terms of limiting congressional power. And in reality, they didn't end up making Congress powerful enough. Okay. Now, the other major highlight regarding Congress that we talked about last week that really kind of relates to what we just said is that not only did the framers make a mistake in terms of underpowering Congress in Article 1, but they also, kind of piled one mistake on top of another, and they also gave Congress too much to do. They gave Congress too many jobs. And if you've had a chance to look, hopefully you have looked over the past week at the Congress notes that I gave to you on Canvas. But if you look at Section 4, the last section, the biggest section by far of the Congress notes, you notice that the framers gave Congress 6 major functions, 6 big jobs that they expected Congress to carry out equally effectively, consistently, all of the time. And as we mentioned last week, and as the notes talk about, the framers were really unrealistic. They gave Congress way too much to do. Members of Congress, even working 24/7, 365, cannot effectively carry out all 6 of their jobs equally well all of the time. So who cares? Well, as we said last week, because members of Congress can't carry out all 6 of their jobs equally well all the time, members of Congress, each individual member of Congress has to prioritize their time. In other words, each member of Congress has to figure out, okay, with the time and energy and effort that I have available to do my job from day to day, which of these 6 jobs that I have do I feel are the most important ones that I should spend most of my time doing? And which of the other of these 6 functions do I feel aren't so important, so I don't really have to focus on those and I can kind of push them off into a corner somewhere, right? Yeah. So as we talked about last week, all members of Congress have to make this calculation. All members of Congress have to make this decision. And as we said last week, and is in the notes, all members of Congress prioritize their time. They make this decision about which functions to emphasize and which ones to de-emphasize in pretty much the same way. Virtually all members of Congress will effectively and consistently carry out those jobs, those congressional functions listed in Section 4 of the notes that help them get the biggest reelection benefit. In other words, they will focus their attention on those parts of their job that will allow them to more easily win elections and to keep their butts in office for as long as they possibly can. So they are driven in how they do their jobs by their reelection obsession. And as we said last week, in a way that's good, but in a way that's bad too. Because here's the thing. If members of Congress do emphasize those jobs that help them get reelected, that does provide some real benefits to us as folks living in the United States. So if members of Congress are regularly carrying out their representative function, their constituent service function, and their public education function, which are all discussed in Section 4 of the Congress notes. That's good. We, the people in the United States, are better off because of that. However, if at the same time members of Congress are not doing much with the other functions, their oversight function, which you are writing about in your congressional, in your discussion forum post on Congress for right now. So if they're not carrying out their oversight function or their conflict resolution function or even their lawmaking function, the country suffers. We, the American people, are made worse off. So the fact that members of Congress are all re-election obsessed is both a good thing for the American people and a bad thing for the American people. And that's what we highlighted last time in dealing with the US Congress. Now, at this point, now that you've had a chance, hopefully, to read through all of the Congress notes in detail, now that you've had a chance to do the assigned readings in Congress that I gave you, and now hopefully that you've had a chance to look at all of the crash course videos on Congress that I gave for you on Canvas, are there any questions that you have about anything that you've learned about Congress in the past week, or any questions about the discussion forum post on Congress that is due tonight at 11:59 p.m., not counting, of course, the 3-day grace period? So any questions at all about Congress at this time, please feel free to unmute your mics and ask a question or put your question in the group chat. So once again, any questions dealing with the US Congress at this time? Anybody? As I grab some caffeine conveniently. Okay, looks like from the group chat we might have a question coming, so I will just take another swallow. And we'll see if a question comes up. See, now would be the time. I got to get better with Zoom so I can start having, music playing in the background while I'm waiting for questions or something fancy like that, right? But I guess I'm not that fancy, at least for right now. Okay, so Jason, do you have a question for me at this point?
Yeah, I'm trying to look for the word. I can't figure out how to say the word, but basically, when Congress passed the bill, when both sides of the party or the building pass the bill to the president, he has the authority to pass it or negate it. And I forgot the word.
No, to veto the bill, you mean?
So yeah, can you go over that word, please? Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. And basically, the veto power, because as we'll talk more about as you'll read more about in the notes on the presidency that we'll go over in a little bit. While Congress is the legislative branch, while Congress is that part of the national government that is ultimately responsible for making national government laws, Congress can't do that alone. Congress cannot make laws simply by themselves. And so here's the deal. If you've read through the very last function of Congress at the very end of our Congress notes, the lawmaking function, you know that Congress goes through an incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging process to try and get a majority of members of the House of Representatives and a majority of members in the upper house of Congress, the US Senate, to agree on a proposed law. Now, if majorities in both houses of Congress agree on that proposed law, it doesn't yet become a law. A proposed law, otherwise known as a bill, does not actually become law until the President of the United States signs at the bottom of the bill. So if the president signs a bill passed by both houses of Congress, bang, it's a law. But guess what? If the president does not like a particular proposed law that was sent to him or her by Congress, the president can go ahead and kill that proposed law with one stroke of his pen. So the president can go ahead and instead of signing the bill into law, the president can choose to veto the bill. And if the president vetoes the bill, then it goes away. It's dead. It never actually becomes a law in the United States. And so that's all that we mean with that fancy sounding term called the presidential veto. Does that make sense?
Yes. And my other question is, um, between vetoing and agreeing to the bill,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't have to say anything, and something about passing. If it passes a certain day, it's going to automatically push forward or deny it.
No, so that is a very limited circumstance. That doesn't happen very often. So if Congress passes a bill and then Congress goes into recess, so if Congress shuts down for a week or 10 days or whatever it is, members of Congress take lots of vacations during the year. So if we have a situation where Congress passes a bill and they then go into recess, if 10 days pass and the president does nothing, the president doesn't sign the bill, then the bill automatically dies. And that's what's called a pocket veto, right? And the reason why they call it a pocket veto, it's as if the president gets the bill, and he reads it and he doesn't like it. And he says, you know what? I don't want this bill to ever become law, but Congress is out of session and I don't want to actually, veto the bill myself. So what I'm just going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and fold up the bill and stick it in my back pocket and just kind of forget that I ever saw it. So yeah, that's a pocket veto, but those don't happen very often. Those only happen in circumstances where Congress passes a bill, then they adjourn, they go into recess, and they're gone, and the president can just let it go for 10 days. And if he lets it go for 10 days, it automatically vetoes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And like I say, those circumstances don't pop up very often. And normally, if a president gets a bill sent to him or her by Congress and they don't like the bill, they don't care. They're not going to say, well, I'll just kind of put it in my pocket and forget about it and hope that nobody mentions it. They'll just go ahead and veto the bill, and they'll do it publicly and say, well, this bill was a piece of junk. I don't like it, so I killed it. What are you going to do about it? I'm the president, right?
Yeah.
So there you go.
Thank you.
So any other questions about the U.S. Congress at this point? Okay, super. So let's go ahead and spend our remaining time together this afternoon previewing the next set of notes that I posted for you up on Canvas yesterday. This is the subject that you'll be dealing with this coming week for the next discussion forum post that will be due not today, but next Thursday. That is the 14th of May at 11:59 p.m. Again, not counting the 3-day grace period. And so over this next week, you are going to be reading about and learning about the second of the three national government branches. That's the presidency, the executive branch that the framers created in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, remember what we said. The U.S. national government was created by the framers using the separation of powers system, right? So each of the three national government branches has its own specific job, its own major type of exclusive authority. Now, as we said last week with Congress, their main responsibility, though they've got lots of other jobs too, but their main responsibility is making national government laws. But on the other hand, so they're the legislative branch, right? They make laws. The president, on the other hand, is the head of what we call the executive branch of the national government. And think about the root word in that word executive, to execute, meaning to carry out something. So as the head of the executive branch, as the chief executive of the United States, the president's main job is to enforce national government laws once Congress actually creates them, okay? Now, if you look at the presidency notes that I gave you on Canvas, again, they're pretty extensive. And most of the presidency notes are taken up with fairly detailed descriptions of the 5 major jobs that the framers gave to the president in Article 2 of the Constitution. And I'm going to leave you to read about those 5 major functions of Congress at your leisure over the next week. Instead, I want to highlight a couple of other really key pieces of information that come up earlier in the presidency notes that I think will help you make better sense of how and why presidents do their jobs, carry out their 5 basic functions in the way that they do. So the first really key point that I want to highlight for you is found at the very beginning of the presidency notes. So not surprisingly, it's in section 1. And if you take a look at section 1 of your presidency notes, you'll notice I give you a discussion just like I did last week with Congress. I give you a discussion about how the framers perceived the presidency when they sat down to create the presidency and the rest of the executive branch in Article 2 of the US Constitution. And again, when you first read through these notes, you might be a little surprised because just as was the case with Congress last week, the American people today perceive and see and understand the presidency in a very different way than the framers did themselves back in 1787. So once again, we're going to ask ourselves that question: how did we get from there to here? How did we get from the framers seeing the presidency in one very specific way, and now today we see the presidency in pretty much the opposite way that the framers did? Well, guess what? Spoiler alert, it's the framers' fault. And we'll talk about how and why that is in a few minutes. But first of all, if you look at the very beginning of the notes there, section 1, it talks about the fact that when the framers sat down to create the structure and function and process and powers of the presidency, the framers really weren't all that worried about the presidency. They really weren't all that fearful about the presidency. The framers really didn't believe that the president had all that much potential to become overly powerful, to spin out of control and abuse their powers and take away the people's natural rights, take away the people's basic freedoms. So think about what I'm saying here and compare it with what I said last week about the framers' attitudes towards Congress. Because remember, the framers thought that Congress was the most powerful and potentially the most dangerous of the 3 national government branches. They didn't really fear the presidency. And in just a minute, we'll talk about why the framers didn't really fear the presidency. And there's a number of reasons, and one might seem a little weird to you, but we'll get there in a minute. But here's the point, right? The framers didn't fear the presidency. The framers didn't think that the president had much potential to abuse its power, become too dangerous, that sort of thing. Well, guess what? If you pay any attention to the US political system today, if you pay any attention to American public opinion today regarding the national government, regarding the 3 national government branches, then one of the things that you know is that today most Americans believe that it is the president that is the most powerful and the most potentially dangerous of the 3 national government branches. So there's that crazy contrast again. The framers weren't worried about the president spinning out of control, but folks living in the United States today and for like the last 50 years or so, we have been very worried about presidents potentially spinning out of control and abusing their authority. So we'll get to the question of how we got from there to here in just a minute, but I want to step back for a second and get to that question that I asked a couple of minutes ago. Why is it that the framers, when they sat down to create the presidency in 1787, why were they not really afraid of the president? Why didn't they believe that the president had much potential to become the most powerful and dangerous of the three national government branches? Well, different, political scientists and American historians and all these folks have been arguing about this question for decades and decades and decades. And there is no one single correct or definitive answer. Certainly, different members of the framers had very different ideas about this, right? But here's a couple of factors, a couple of reasons that I want to go ahead and share with you. Now, remember, think back to the beginning of the semester, back when we were still meeting face to face on the second floor of the T building, right? Remember back early in the semester, we were talking about all of the things the framers did, all the priorities that they had in creating the US Constitution. And remember what we said at the time. We said that one of the two biggest priorities that the framers had in creating our current Constitution is that they were trying to create, figure out, how much control the average voter should have over what government does. Remember that? And because of that concern over how much influence, how much power the average American voter should have over government, that the framers created this crazy compromise, right? Remember the compromise between Madison's group versus Hamilton's group at the Philadelphia Convention? They created this really weird system to elect the president, right? The Electoral College. Remember, we talked about this quite a bit. And remember what we said, both then and now, because of the Electoral College system, the average American voter does not directly choose the president of the United States. Now, this system, this Electoral College system, especially the original system that the framers created under the Constitution, I think is one of the reasons why the framers really didn't fear a president kind of going crazy and spinning out of control and abusing their power and that sort of thing. Because remember how the original Electoral College system worked? That ordinary voters would go out and select really good, smart people from their own communities that they knew, and they put them in the Electoral College. And it was those good, smart, elite people who would get together and they would decide who the next president would be. Well, think about it, right? The framers hoped, the framers believed that these very smart, elite people that would be part of the Electoral College, that they would do a very good and careful job of selecting just the right person to become president of the United States. And while a few of the framers expressed concerns, what would we do? How would the country survive? If we elected a crazy president, and I'm not getting into that any further than just saying that. Most framers believed that the members of the Electoral College would be sufficiently with it, sufficiently smart, sufficiently picky, that they would be able to select a good, thoughtful, non-crazy, non-power hungry person to be president. So that's one major reason that the framers didn't really fear the possibility of a crazy, overly powerful, or abusive president. Now, does that make sense, first of all? Any questions about that? Either unmute your mic or put a question in the group chat. Okay, now, the other reason, and this is the one that you might think is a little bit more strange, right? The other reason that the framers really didn't fear an overly powerful or abusive president in the future is that the framers were operating under a rather large assumption. And the rather large assumption that the framers were operating under, and I know this is going to sound weird at first, but most of them firmly believed that all American presidents would be kind of like George Washington, right? Now, obviously, when the Constitution was still being written, we haven't even had our first presidential election yet. But the framers knew in their heart of hearts that when the first presidential election was held under our new Constitution, hands down, not even a question, George Washington was going to be elected the first president of the United States. Why? Because in 1787, George Washington was the best known, the most well-respected, and the most beloved figure in the United States, period, end of story, right? And so the framers knew he was going to be the first president. The framers also believed that George Washington, if he wanted to, could have ended up serving as president for life. Because remember, when they first wrote the Constitution, they didn't put in a term limit for the president. Someone could be president for as long as they could keep getting reelected. And so they were kind of shocked when Washington stepped down, when he did not seek a third term as president. Because even by the end of 8 years in office, Washington was still the most popular, the most well-respected, the most beloved figure in the United States. And so because of this, the framers just assumed, well, we've created this really good, careful process for selecting future presidents. All presidents are going to be like George Washington. Well, it hasn't exactly turned out that way, right? And, I would say that there are, in a way, it may be sometimes bad that not all presidents are like George Washington, but guess what? We could argue that it would sometimes be good that not all presidents are like George Washington. We'll talk more about that maybe a little bit next week if we have time. But in any event, for those reasons, the framers just weren't scared of the presidency. They just didn't think the president would ever abuse their powers because George Washington would never abuse his powers as president, right? Now, here's the point. Yeah, and Jason says in the group chat, he was the standard. Yeah, he really was, at least for the framers, right? But here's the thing. That's how we got from there to here. Because remember what we said. The framers didn't fear the president spinning out of control, abusing their power. But today, most Americans do. Most Americans see the president as being the most powerful and dangerous part of the national government. Why? It's the framers' fault. Because here's the thing. As I talk about in section 1 in the notes, the framers were so unconcerned about presidential abuse of power that they didn't sweat the details when they were creating the structure and function and process and power of the presidency in Article 2. They didn't carefully specify what the president could and could not do, like they did with Congress in Article 1, because they didn't fear the president abusing power. So if the president's not going to abuse power, the framers said, look, we don't have to go into a lot of detail about what powers the president has and what powers the president doesn't have. They didn't try and box the president in. And it's interesting, if you take a copy of Article 1, which describes Congress, and put it side by side with a copy of Article 2 of the Constitution, which describes the presidency, you will immediately notice Article 2 is much shorter than Article 1, and it is a lot more vague. It is a lot less specific than Article 1. The framers didn't sweat the details on the presidency because they didn't fear the presidency. And guess what? As you will read, as you go through the presidency notes in detail, modern presidents, meaning presidents starting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, So starting with FDR, every president, including FDR, going all the way up to the present day in 2020 and our 45th president, Donald J. Trump, every modern president has intentionally sought to significantly expand their level of power and authority. And many of them have been very successful in doing so. So the power of the presidency has grown dramatically, exponentially since the 1930s. Why? Because as I say in the notes, modern presidents have exploited the lack of detail in Article 2. They took advantage of the fact that the framers did not try and box the president in. And so what a lot of modern presidents have done is they'll start acting in a different way. They'll essentially invent a new power for themselves. And if Congress or the American people try to challenge them, they say, hey, wait a minute, Mr. President, you can't take that action. Article 2 doesn't say that you can do that thing. Well, the president can say, well, okay, fine. Article 2 may not say that I can do that thing, but it also doesn't say that I can't do that thing. See how that works? And so that's how we got from there to here. That's why today, the vast majority of us in the United States, for better or for worse, believe that the president is the most powerful and the most dangerous of the three national government branches. And Jason in the group chat says the gray area. Oh yeah, there are lots of bits of the Constitution that constitute a really big gray area. Now, next week, right, when we preview the next section of information, the judicial branch, the court system, we're going to come back to that gray area, because here's the thing. It is the job of the courts, of the judicial branches we'll talk about next week, to try and clear up that gray area as much as they can. Because remember, it's the job of the judicial branch to interpret the laws, to tell us what the laws actually mean in practice. So stay tuned. So you got to come back next Thursday afternoon to find out what we have to say about how the courts deal with that gray area. Ooh, you know, I'll leave you in suspense for 7 days, right? Yeah, okay, well, I do what I can, right? Okay, so any questions about anything that we've said so far about the presidency?
I have a comment.
Sure.
I was noticing.
Oh, and by the way, just because the only thing I see on my screen is iPhone. Whose iPhone am I talking to right now?
I didn't put my name in. This is okay. Paige. Sorry.
Okay. Glad to have you with me.
Yeah, I forgot to put my name in. Whoops.
No worries.
I was just trying to consider like all of the main themes throughout like each topic we talk about.
Right.
And I noticed that it seems as if that the framers didn't really have a perception of freedom versus order. And it kind of seems like the president almost was given too much freedom and not enough order, and that almost vice versa with Congress. Just kind of a relation to one of our main themes, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the framers, they really, and sometimes, you know, I think we kind of get the impression that the framers really weren't thinking about a lot of this stuff, and they really were. You know, the framers were trying to juggle so many different priorities and objectives and problems that they had to fix in creating the Constitution. And they thought that they had solved a lot of those problems, kind of as you described them just now. They solved a lot of those problems when they decided that they were going to create, you know, separation of powers and checks and balances in the national government. And remember what we said in the Zoom a couple of weeks ago, as I was introducing this section of the class, that when the framers made the decision to go to the separation of powers system for our current Constitution, one of the basic assumptions that they made was that the president, Congress, and the courts would all have roughly equal levels of power and authority, so that they tried to design a system where one branch would not be able to overpower the other two. And so they kind of proceeded from that. And, you know, I think it's really easy today to kind of, you know, criticize the framers, right? But here's the thing. I mean, were the framers perfect? Lord, no. Did they make lots of mistakes? Oh, yeah, they sure did. But, you know, here's the thing. The framers made lots of mistakes, but when you consider the frame of reference that they had, what they knew about
Right.
government back then in 1787, and what the country was like, and what the world was like back then, you know, I think that they did an amazing job because, in a sense,
Right. It's too different to even really
Yeah.
compare what they would
Oh
need
yeah,
to be taken care of.
yeah. I mean,
It's too different.
yeah, can you imagine their horror? You know, and I think I've talked about this in class before, back when we were face to face. Can you imagine their horror if we could somehow dig them up and reanimate them and stand them up and have them take a look around at the country today? They probably want to get back in the ground right away. You know,
Definitely.
so from their frame of reference, I mean, honestly, they did an amazing job. Were they perfect? By no means. But based on what they had to work with, I think it's pretty good. I mean, because here's
I mean,
the thing.
they were setting up their own government. That's
Right.
an incredibly difficult thing to do, and try to make it different from where they came from
Mhm.
without,
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I can
oh, no,
imagine how impossible that would be.
exactly. And it's interesting in one of the other classes that I'm teaching this semester, not Poli-Sci 1 or 1H, but I'm also teaching Poli-Sci 11 right now, which is Introduction to Western Political Thought. So it's a political theory, a political philosophy class. And it just so happens that right now we are in what's called the classical liberal period in that class. And we're talking about political philosophers like John Locke and Baron Montesquieu from France and Adam Smith and people like that. And all of those people, all of these people that we talk about in Poli-Sci 11 that we call classical liberal philosophers are the philosophers that the framers, the folks who wrote our Constitution, were all reading. And really the framers were all believers in this classical liberal philosophy. And the reason why I bring that up right now is the fact that one of the philosophers that the framers all read and loved and talked about, you know, before, during, and after the Philadelphia Convention was this British political philosopher, a guy by the name of Thomas Hobbes. Now, the thing about Hobbes, I can say a lot about Hobbes, but we're already running overtime. But the one thing about Hobbes that's interesting and made me think about him right now in the context of your question is that Hobbes believed that for the good of whatever country you were in, when you were trying to create a governmental system for that country, you had to create, or you wanted to try and create, what Hobbes called an eternal constitution. Now, think about that terminology for a second. An eternal constitution. So in other words, Hobbes said, you want to do the best job you can in creating a framework for government in your country that could last indefinitely, that could last for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. And
Right.
so
it has to be vague.
Yes, excellent. That's certainly true. And the framers were very inspired by this. They really sat down to try and create an eternal constitution from their limited time frame, their limited knowledge, their limited framework. So to some extent, it has to be vague. You're quite right. And the other reason why they were so set on trying to do this is because they remembered the Articles of Confederation, right? That mess that they created in 1777, right? That only lasted about 13 years. And they said, oh, we don't want to go through that again. We don't want to have to get together in 20 years when we're barely still able to stand up and go through this again and try and create another constitution. The country just can't survive it. So we want to create a constitution that could last conceivably for hundreds of years. An eternal constitution, in Hobbes' words. But the question is, and it's really an interesting question for us to ask from our framework today, is that even possible, right? I mean, think about how much our country and how much the world has changed between 1787 and 2020. I mean, think about how much the world has changed just in the last 2 months, right? How do you create an eternal constitution? It's a tough sell. It's a tough thing to do.
Wow, yeah. And then if you were to say like, well, you can change it whenever you need to change it, then it would probably go way out of hand.
If you make it too easy to change, it falls apart. But if you make it too difficult to change, it could fall apart too. So it's such a delicate balance. That's the problem. That's the problem. So we have gone 5 minutes overtime, and I apologize for that, but I thank you. I mean, you guys have asked some really great questions today. I really appreciate your thinking on this stuff as always. So let me just quickly wrap up just with a few reminders. Remember, the discussion forum post on Congress is due technically tonight at 11:59 p.m., a minute before midnight, as Canvas likes to do, right? But remember, you also have an additional 3 days, an additional 72 hours to finish that discussion forum post on Congress and submit it to me via Canvas without any grade penalty for lateness. As I mentioned at the beginning of class, before everyone got here, I will be grading your test number 2 for this class tomorrow. So look for the scores for test number 2 a bit later on in the day tomorrow. I'll have those for you, okay? And I'll post them on Canvas, obviously. As soon as I get them, you'll get them, right? And remember, next Thursday, I'll deal with any questions that you have left over from the presidency. Any questions that you have about that presidency discussion post that'll be due next Thursday. And then I will also next Thursday preview the next section of information. Remember, dealing with the gray area of the Constitution, the judicial branch, right? The folks who interpret national government laws. But remember, between now and then, you need to talk to me for any reason, whether dealing with this class or anything else that you think I can help you with. Call or send me an email, send me a Canvas message, drop into my virtual student hours, Monday and Wednesday afternoons, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Or if you want to set up a one-on-one Zoom with me, please send me a Canvas message or an email. We'll work out a day and time and we'll do it. Remember, I am always here for you. We are going to get through this class successfully. We are going to get through this time in our lives successfully because we're connected. We're together. Remember, you are never alone. I'm here. So until I talk to you next time, be safe, take care, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you,
Have a good
Professor.
one.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.